I've only been involved in human rights for 3 years. I am not a human rights professional. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an academic, and I'm certainly no intellectual. But what I am, for what it's worth, is a businessman. And what struck me in the last 3 years is the sort of paucity of understanding of the impact that business has both in political and legal and human rights terms. I mean, I'm not sure I'm overstating it by saying that probably business is the most powerful force on the planet, and I will explain why I think that. And some of it is malign, and some of it is helpful. I'm going to probably slant more towards the malign today, just because it's kind of more interesting, really. So there are kind of two strands I want to just explore with you. And one is about the influence that business has on politics. And throughout the world, and many of you will be familiar with these countries, there are countries where essentially there has been state capture by business interests. And I just was in Guatemala last year on human rights rather than on business. And it's a long history, but without boring you, those who are not familiar with it, essentially a small coterie of businessmen have captured the country, enforced their will through private armies essentially, and the government is, in my view, nothing more than a puppet government. And there are others which Hamid will know about in Iran. I mean, I think you could argue that it's pretty close to state capture there. The Revolutionary Guard is much more than just a kind of military outfit. It owns most of the, I'm not sure most, but a very significant tranche of the business interests and the business resources in Iran. And a lot of the political stuff that it does is actually about protecting that.
And Egypt.
What may not be so apparent is, and may not be so well understood, is the power and proximity of business to politics in countries that we would all consider to be largely democratic. The UK, France, and really most notably the US. And so I was sort of curious about 5 years ago, because I've been reading about sort of cash for honours, and so I wanted to see how far you could actually get. So I joined the Conservative Party, and I gave them really quite a small amount of money, which shouldn't really be able to buy you a lot of influence. And then I wanted to see how far I could get with this. Well, the truth is that within 2 weeks, there I found myself in a lunch with 2 cabinet ministers for a really very small amount of money. Now, it may be that they kind of thought that I would give them some more. I'm not really suggesting that they were kind of opening themselves up to influence, but I do sort of have a hunch that proximity to power gives you influence. It just must do. So if you extrapolate that several thousand times more, and you look at what, for instance, is happening in the US, in the 2016 presidential election, the Koch brothers, who are, I hope this is not being recorded, I'll probably end up in litigation here, who are a thoroughly unpleasant pair of ultra-right, conservative, I mean, everything that we would probably all feel were not appropriate attributes to be close to the political center of the United States, gave $100 million to various conservative groups. Robert Mercer, who is the president of a thing called Renaissance Technologies, he's essentially a kind of glorified hedge fund, funded Breitbart, who you will all be familiar with. And more importantly, was the backer and the funder of Steve Bannon, who you will also be familiar with. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, without Steve Bannon, could Donald Trump have won the nomination and won the presidential election? Well, we'll never know the answer, but I can tell you that without Mercer's money and without Bannon's backing, Trump's chances of success were significantly reduced, let alone sort of interference from Russia and so on. So now we find ourselves with a president in the White House who I have every confidence will, in goodness of time, history will relate that his and his family are proximate to ostensibly a criminal enterprise. And I quote the Washington Post: "No serious presidential candidate has ever had Trump's depth of documented business relationships with mob-controlled entities." This is a man who did business with the mafia, and he doesn't deny it, he acknowledges it. And what does he actually say about it? Trump's response was, well, they were very good builders. I suspect that business control of at least parts of the US political system draws that country dangerously close to state capture. And those people who have funded this, the businessmen who have funded this, I can assure you have scant interest in justice, in the rule of law, and in human rights. The compounding danger is that Trump and his associates have endorsed, quite strongly in cases, some of the most unsavory leaders on our planet, encouraging people like Duterte and Sisi and Erdogan. And presumably, this can have nothing but a negative effect on impunity. And indeed, I was with the number two actually at Soros' organisation, and George Soros is absolutely convinced that the increase in rhetoric and aggression from Viktor Orban in Hungary is directly linked to license ostensibly from the White House. So this has real impact on the world that all of you are trying to combat. And the source of it is money, and money from business. So the second strand that I want to talk about is the power of corporates in terms of how they control information, not just political influence, but information, and how they control all of us. So just to give you the size and the sense of scale of what we're faced with, the MSCI World Global Index, just Morgan Stanley's World Global Index, which tracks the share price of the top 1,600 companies in the world, estimate that the market capitalization, so the global value of these companies, is $36 trillion. Now, just to give you an idea, the US debt is 16 trillion, and that is just an unconscionable amount of money. So this is more than double. And what's interesting about these companies is not that they are almost uniquely technology companies. They aren't all the technology companies, but a lot of them are, including Apple and Alphabet and Amazon and Microsoft and Facebook. But it is their relative youth, many of them having been created in the last 15 or 20 years. These companies have global markets. They have no capital constraints. And therefore, you can safely assume that we will see the first trillion-dollar company in the not too distant future. And what's important about these companies, not just about their size, but it is about the fact that they control the modern means of production, which in today's world essentially means information. And the phenomenon is not confined to the US or the Western world. The so-called bat companies, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, practically run Chinese internet and control a significant flow of information. And what makes them so powerful is that they monopolize information and access to information on a globalized scale. Almost every other business and organization is interlocked and dependent on these companies. So just to give you an idea, at a slightly more parochial level, when I founded my business in the late 90s, we spent 90% of our advertising budget on old media outlets, so radio, newspapers, TV, and so on. 20 years later, we spend 90% of it on our digital platform, and 90% of that, so 80% roughly of our total spend, with two companies, Google and Facebook. And the fact is, they hold complete power over us. If they want to change the rules of engagement, or indeed the price, we have no choice but to comply. And in the past, when similar monopolies occurred, governments have had the power to regulate. So in 1911, the US Supreme Court, quite the government, but as good as in the US, ruled that Standard Oil, John Rockefeller's oil vehicle, was an illegal monopoly and ordered its breakup. And indeed, component bits of it still exist today, including Chevron and Exxon and so on. So the question is, are governments powerful enough to combat the insidious, in my view, monopolistic, octopus-like power of these new, largely technology companies? I had some very significant doubts about that for a number of reasons. But in a sense, the proof is in the pudding. So the European antitrust officials, led by Margaret Vestager, have recently fined Google 2.4 billion euros for illegally preferring its own services over others. But quite frankly, it's a drop in the ocean and will have no impact at all on them. And this follows a 7-year investigation. The ruling was made about 18 months ago, and all they did was kind of move their service provision around, got round the rules. Now there'll have to be another antitrust investigation. The salient point that I'm trying to make is that it's almost impossible in such a fast-moving technological environment for governments to keep up with it. And then I'm afraid to say that to add to this, we, all of us in this room as consumers, aid and abet this process. Their source of power is information, and we willingly trade that in an unalloyed trade of convenience over privacy. This information about us has always been out there. It's always been available. But I think about it in terms of each one of us having a small collection of books about us. And those books have been scattered around a kind of world-sized library. And so just by dint of the amount of information that was out there, nobody could actually access anything very interesting about us individually until recently. But because we've made this kind of Faustian pact, those books now sit nice and neatly on one shelf and are completely accessible by these technology companies. And the power that we have given them is, in my view, quite extraordinary. And so where has this led us? So I give you a quote. This is not a government of the people, by the people, for the people any longer. It's a government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations. Now, interestingly, that quote is not a modern quote. It actually comes from President Rutherford Hayes, who's one of those complete non-entities between Lincoln and Roosevelt in 1888. But the difference is that they were able to break the power of these large corporations. And now, I'm afraid to say, I do not believe that regulation is sufficient to force the curbing of the worst excesses of these companies, or indeed to foist on them some kind of positive action and make them good corporate citizens. In essence, no legal framework, I believe, because it's by definition reactive, can keep up with the change of pace of technology and just change the pace of globalization. However, we do all have a part to play in this, I think, in that the real power that we have is as consumers and as employees, and this is never more appropriate and relevant in an age of what I call radical transparency. What I mean by that is that there is no action, there's no change, there's no policy or behaviour that is now not scrutinised through seemingly endless channels of social media. There is literally no place to hide. The important point about that is that the consumer is everyone. Everyone includes employees, and although trade unions hold some residual power, a much more effective balancer of power is actually us as consumers and employees. For the simple reason that in a globalized world, whereas in a globalized world where trade unions are bound by national borders to a larger extent, employees and consumers are endlessly mobile and know no boundaries. The multiplier effect, therefore, of radical transparency means influence can be exerted on companies everywhere and anywhere and any time. The toughest penalties that companies face for breaching, we carry out our business, and on Friday afternoons we think about corporate social responsibility for half an hour. This is a quote from Howard Davis, who was the head of the CBI, which is a collective business organisation in the UK. All public companies in most jurisdictions in Europe and North America, at least, are required to produce audited corporate social responsibility statements. It's a classic bit of regulation that allows companies to produce pages of worthy documentation, most of which means absolutely nothing, whilst in fact doing precisely nothing. Even commitments under specific bits of legislation are mostly just words. So if you've read the statements by most companies, for instance, under the UK's Modern Slavery Act, they are just that, completely meaningless. And the shroud or the screen is that as long as you put the statement out, actually what you do doesn't sort of terribly matter. And so the regulation, whilst it exists, has no teeth in any shape or form. Since the Modern Slavery Act was introduced in the UK in 2015, there have only been 63 prosecutions. And that's just astonishing. The toughest penalty that companies face for breaching anti-slavery legislation is in the court of public opinion, so long as there is enough public scrutiny. The business of social responsibility, and more specifically human rights, is real business for businesses. Interestingly, the owners of these businesses may be more advanced in their thinking than the managers. It's worth pointing out that publicly traded companies, and even a large proportion of privately owned ones, are owned by us, the public, and the consumer. So what can we do to harness the very considerable power and wealth of the corporate world to effect improvements to human rights? In my view, it's about education, it's about mobilization, and it is about familiarization, as well as the stick of the law and regulation. Similarly, wearing my human rights hat, it's a new one, you, need to make common interests with business and business leaders. And this is important because in political circles, and indeed within the human rights community, particularly since the financial crisis, business has been treated as something of a pariah. Now, there may in good instances be good reasons why that is right and just. But of course, it's probably not very helpful in trying to persuade business and business leaders to come to our assistance. We need to understand the motives behind business and its methods and channel that where we can, whilst of course robustly challenging where wrong is perpetrated. And I'll just leave you with a quote from Agnes McCabe, who is Director of Anti-Slavery International. Governments will pay attention to business in a way they won't to human rights organisations. This is a powerful force and we need to engage with it. We need to harness it to our advantage, whilst of course being completely alive to all its flaws and failures.